Part 46. The regent is a yandere who needs to be pampered. Author, Nan Huang. Chapter 451. In fact, Xiejin had seen people with big ears, people with prominent status, and people who were pretentious and bluffing. A mere prince of Yu kingdom was nothing in his eyes. It was just that when Rong Yu ordered him to pick up the person, his tone was obviously a bit annoyed, but he allowed the person to exist despite being annoyed. And so far, the only thing that could make Rong Yu compromise was someone or something related to Nan 11. This was the reason why Xiejin was willing to tolerate it. If this person really had some kind of relationship with Her Majesty the Queen, then even if he felt a little aggrieved, he couldn't offend him for the time being. After all, the visitor was a guest. However, he had always been an ancestor who was used to being praised by others, and it was obviously not a pleasant thing to be treated coldly by this person here. After entering the palace gate, he didn't say anything more, and finally sent the person to the Dajhan palace safely before he was angry to death. Originally, he wanted to leave immediately and ignore this inexplicable prince, but he really wanted to know what kind of relationship this man had with His Majesty that could make his master, who was so possessive and paranoid, tolerate him. But he never expected that as soon as the sedan stopped at the Dajhan palace, he couldn't wait to speak. Is Her Majesty in the palace? Xiejin said in a light tone, Your Majesty is the master of this Dajhan palace, where else can you go if not in the palace? As soon as the voice fell, the curtain of the sedan was lifted by a porcelain white hand, and a beautiful jade white young man like a fairy walked out of it. His face was like ice sculptures and jade, and his skin was so white that it really looked like it was carved from top-grade jade. His figure was slender, much more slender than that of ordinary men. He was wearing a cloud-colored fox fur coat that was whiter than snow, which made him look like a fairy who walked out of the snow. Xiejin raised his eyebrows slightly, and he was born with a good-looking face. It's a pity that his personality is really not very likable. He walked towards the red lacquered gate of Dajhan Palace. Qing Yang, who saw him coming in, had already entered the palace to report and walked out quickly. His Majesty and the regent asked Mr. Xie to come in. Xiejin nodded, thank you. Qing Yang said solemnly, Mr. Xie, you are welcome. As he spoke, his eyes fell on the face of a man in a cloud-colored fox fur coat. Seeing that his face was as white as cold jade, he frowned slightly. Is this young master sick? Why is his face so pale? You are sick. Zhanruo glanced at him coldly. This prince is born with white skin. Who is as black as coal like you? Qing Yang was stunned. Why is this young master so angry? Why is he as black as coal? Qing Yang touched his face. Is his skin color normal? At this moment, a squeak sound was heard, and the white, flexible little thing leaped over like lightning, and in the blink of an eye jumped into Zhanruo's arms, grabbing his clothes and baring his teeth. Squeak. Zhanruo looked down at it. Someone bullied you. Squeak. The regent, that annoying guy, wants to stew you. Zhanruo sneered. Does he dare? Squeak. Don't be afraid, he said in a light tone. With me here, he dare not do anything to you. Xiejin turned his head and glanced at him, thinking that this guy was indeed not normal. Zhanruo stepped into the hall with the snow ferret in his arms. The first thing he saw was the furnishings of the outer hall. He saw a sandalwood desk with a dragon pattern, on which were placed the 4 treasures of the imperial study, memorials to be approved, jade seals, and a pile of files. Behind the desk was a 9-dragon golden chair, and behind the chair was a royal screen. Forget it, none of this is important. The important thing is that there is a person sitting on the chair behind the imperial desk, a cold and aloof man with a strong demeanor. Zhanruo's eyes fell on his face, and his eyes were slightly cold. This position should not be occupied by you. Xian Yuanyao and Ling Fan had not left yet, and were standing in front of the desk at this time. Hearing this, they all turned their heads to look at Zhanruo. Who are you? How dare you point fingers in the Dongling Palace? Xian Yuanyao frowned. Your country has been at peace for these years, do you think the world is peaceful? Do you want this general to tell you what the power of the Iron Cavalry is? Jean Rouault ignored him and turned to look at the inner hall. A woman in a bright yellow outer robe came out, with a beautiful face, calm eyebrows, and a faint smile at the corners of her lips. You are a guest from afar. Prince Jean Rouault, please take a seat. Jean Rouault looked at her with a bit of inquiry in his eyes, but he spoke in a tone of confirmation, Your Majesty. Nan 11 smiled and nodded, it's me. Jean Rouault's arrogance was restrained a little, and his eyebrows were slightly frowned, reviewing memorials and making decisions on state affairs, shouldn't it be the power of Your Majesty? Nan 11 gently stroked her bulging belly, I am pregnant and it is inconvenient for me to work at the moment, so the government affairs will be fully handled by the regent. Jean Rouault was stunned, his eyes fell on her belly subconsciously, and he said, How did you get pregnant? This is what he said. Xian Yuanyao sneered, Are you a fool? Your Majesty is a woman, it is not normal for her to get pregnant after getting married. If it weren't for the consideration of Your Majesty's reputation, it would not be appropriate to discuss this matter here, he would have thrown this sentence in his face. Foretelling the future? How does this person look like a master who can predict the future? Sister Jean Rouault said, frowning slightly, you can divorce him. I will raise this child. As soon as these words came out, the palace was silent. Rong Yu tightened his grip on the red pen, raised his eyes slightly, and his eyes were filled with a bone-chilling coldness. Xian Yuanyao was stunned. Sister. Where did this person come from? He looked older than Her Majesty, so why was he called sister? Sure enough, he is a fool. Xiejin understood that this person was indeed somehow related to Her Majesty the Queen, so it was no wonder that his master was willing to tolerate him. Prince is joking. Nan 11's smile faded, Rong Yu is my husband, how could I divorce him? But he. Jean Rouault frowned, he is not a good person. Xian Yuanyao turned his head to look at Xiejin, pointed at his head, and said silently, is there anything wrong with him? Before Xiejin spoke, Rong Yu had already stood up, walked around the imperial desk, and forcefully embraced Nan 11 in his arms. Prince Jean Rouault must be tired after a long journey. Xian Yuanyao, since he has a way to solve the siege of Dongling, you and Ling Fan will be responsible for entertaining him, and discuss with him the countermeasures to deal with the siege. Xian Yuanyao was about to nod in response, but Jean Rouault spoke first, unless you let me enter the harem of Her Majesty the Queen and let me be the Emperor's husband, otherwise I will let all countries in the world continue to increase their troops and make Dongling powerless to fight back. Nan 11's expression faded, Prince Jean Rouault is joking. Sister, I'm not joking. Jean Rouault pursed her lips, I'm here to protect you. The regent is a yandere who needs to be pampered. Author, Nan Huang. Chapter 452. Nan 11 looked at his face. Rong Yu said he was 18 years old, but maybe because this person's skin was too white, his face exuded a kind of dust-free beauty, but his eyebrows and eyes were a little immature, so he didn't look like 18 years old. But no matter what, it was not appropriate to call her sister in front of so many people. Nan 11 smiled faintly, I heard that Prince Jean Rouault is proficient in divination and can predict the future. Jean Rouault nodded, yes. So you predicted that Dongling would be destroyed? Jean Rouault was stunned, then shook his head subconsciously, of course not. Dongling has a sister as the queen, how could it be destroyed? Then I, the queen, will be taken away by the king of another country to be his wife. Jean Rouault's eyebrows suddenly turned cold, who dares? Nan 11 smiled faintly, since no one dares to take me, Dongling will not be destroyed, which means that I don't need the protection of others. Jean Rouault, after a moment of shock, he finally understood what she meant, sister. Besides, my husband is the most powerful man in the world. Nan 11 turned her head and glanced at Rong Yu, who looked surprised, with a gentle look on her face, with his strength alone, he can protect me. Jean Rouault's expression was slightly stiff, and he glared at Rong Yu coldly, cunning fox. Rong Yu gently supported Nan 11's waist with one hand. His originally not so good mood was coaxed away by Nan 11's words. At this time, the spring breeze was blowing and the sun was shining, so he naturally didn't care about the childish provocation of the guy opposite. But just because he didn't care, it didn't mean that the three people watching next to him could remain calm. Xiejin stroked his chin and thought to himself, this scene in front of him didn't look right. Did Prince Jean Rouault know his master? Why did it smell like gunpowder at this time, as if enemies were meeting and getting jealous? And this gunpowder smell seemed to be caused by jealousy. However, the queen's reaction was obviously not very familiar with Prince Jean Rouault, so the regent had the upper hand. This arrogant and irritated Prince Jean Rouault was like a poor little thing in front of the queen. He was so low in status, but he dared to put on airs. Who gave him the confidence? Xiejin's mind turned quickly, and he quickly judged the situation in front of him. It was just that the most critical reason was not clear. However, the reason was not important, just like he still didn't know what secrets there were between Rong Yu and the high priest, but it did not hinder his analysis of the situation. Prince Jean Rouault is 18 years old this year, he spoke casually, with a smile on his lips. Her Majesty is younger than you. It seems inappropriate for you, a grown man, to act like a child here. According to the rules, the prince should respectfully address Her Majesty and pay homage to Her Majesty according to the etiquette of a vassal state. Jean Rouault turned his head to look at him, his eyebrows stern. Who do you think you are? How dare you teach me to do things here? Xiejin smiled slightly, looking at the ignorant child in front of him expressionlessly, with a hint of coldness on the corner of his lips. I was wrong just now. The prince is not pretending to be a child, but is simply a naive and ignorant child. Jean Rouault smiled coldly, obviously not wanting to waste words with him. His eyes quickly fell back on Nan 11's face and said lightly, I really can't let Dongling perish, and I can't just watch it happen. The kings of various countries are rude to my sister, but if my sister insists on protecting this person, I will cause chaos in the world, plunge the people of Dongling into war, completely overturn the peaceful Dongling for 600 years, and let this land be engulfed by war and gunpowder from now on. My sister said that he is the most powerful person in the world, so let's see how he can turn the tide in the end. After saying this, he turned and walked out, walked a few steps and turned his head again and said, now that the prophecy has just spread all over the 9 states and 4 seas, of course, the countries will not start the expedition so quickly, but even if the kings of various countries are concerned about the ability of the great Zhou god of war, this concern will eventually be overcome by ambition. Today I swear here that within 2 months, all countries will definitely come with heavy troops. Sister, be ready to let Rong Huijin go to the battlefield. After the voice fell, he swept his body and left the Dajhan palace without looking back. Xiejin, Lingfan, and Xian Yuanyao all stared at his back in silence, without any movement, without stopping, and without scolding. As for the imperial guards on duty outside the Dajhan palace, they didn't even have time to react. They only saw a white figure flash in front of them and disappeared in an instant. The palace fell into a brief silence. Xiejin was thoughtful. Even though he was suspicious, he didn't show any strangeness on his face. Rong Huijin? If he heard it right, Jean Rouault did say this name just now, but Rong Huijin was clearly the regent who monopolized power by the side of Empress Jinghua 200 years ago, and the criminal minister of Dongling who committed suicide in the end. Of course, it was only the criminal minister recorded in history books. As for what secrets are hidden in it, no one knows except the ancestors 200 years ago. This person mentioned Rong Huijin because he thought Rong Yu was Rong Huijin 200 years ago? Or because he had foresight and thought Rong Yu was the reincarnation of Rong Huijin 200 years ago? Xiejin's eyebrows deepened. Empress Jinghua had a regent by her side 200 years ago, and Empress Ronghua now also has a regent by her side, Ronghua. Ronghuijin, Empress Jinghua. My Lord Lingfan spoke to break the silence and pulled Xiejin back to his senses. Do we need to respond to what Prince Zanruo said as soon as possible? Ignore him, Rongyu said indifferently, you guys go down first. If you meet him in the palace, don't interfere with his actions, and don't be too enthusiastic about him. Lingfan nodded. This sentence actually had little to do with him. He is not from Dongling, so he is not responsible for entertaining guests from Dongling. Besides, the Prince Zanruo is not familiar with him and seems to be a bit difficult to get along with. He is not interested in dealing with such a person. Besides, he will leave for Dazhu early tomorrow morning and has no time to care about an irrelevant person. Xiejin and Xian Yuanyao are different. The ninth master of the Xie family has become a favorite of the regent in the past 2 days. He is the one who runs errands and entertains guests. Therefore, even if Rongyu says to ignore this Prince Zanruo, he still needs to pay attention to him. After walking out of the Dajhan palace, Xian Yuanyao, who was full of questions, finally couldn't help asking, Ajin, what do you think is the relationship between the Prince Zanruo from Yu country and His Majesty? Xiejin paused and turned to look at his handsome face. Xian Yuanyao was puzzled by his gaze. What's wrong? Nothing. Xiejin shook his head, with a meaningful smile on his lips. Whether Prince Zanruo has any relationship with your Majesty, I don't know yet, but the relationship between the master and him must not be very good. Xian Yuanyao nodded. Yeah, I can see it. When Prince Zanruo saw Rongyu, he was like a cat with its fur standing on end, wishing he could pounce on him and take a bite. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. The regent is a yandere who needs to be pampered. Author, Nan Huang. Chapter 453. Nan 11 turned and walked into the inner hall, sat down on the brocade couch, took a sip of the hot tea presented by Yin Yu, and said, Prince Zhanruo looks more like a child who has not grown up, which is not consistent with what you said about being indifferent to fame and fortune. Rongyu stood aside and nodded, it is indeed childish. Nan 11 laughed, have you been resentful of him for a long time? I guess so. Rongyu frowned and sat down beside her, just different positions. Nan 11 was silent for a moment. Different positions. If it was just a different position, she could understand it. After all, Rongyu said in person that the princes under Empress Jinghua respected the sister very much, and the relationship between the siblings was deep, but Ronghuijin 200 years ago was the murderer who caused the civil strife and indirectly killed Dan Shu. Not only Dan Shu's brothers thought so, but also the ministers of Dongling at that time. Therefore, whether it is the high priest or Zhanruo, they all think that Ronghuijin was the sinner of the year. The difference is that the high priest is a servant of the gods, and his personal emotions are not so strong. He just condemns from the perspective of the righteousness of the family and the people of the world. Zhanruo is different. He is a person who has personally experienced the chaotic civil war and the separation of life and death in the past. He saw his beloved sister die because of someone with his own eyes, and naturally he hates her in his heart, of course. Perhaps as early as when Ronghuijin and Dan Shu fell in love, it aroused the strong dissatisfaction of the prince, and then caused an irreconcilable conflict between the two. After Dan Shu's death, the prince had to take on the entire Dongling Shirji as the regent of the emperor's father, and assisted his son until the young emperor took power at the age of 16. In other words, he was the regent for 10 years, and during these 10 years, he might have missed his sister every day, and the more he missed her, the deeper his hatred for Ronghuijin. From the perspective of a bystander, Nan 11 can completely understand. Although she understood, Nan 11 couldn't stand on the same side with him. Not to mention that she didn't have that memory yet, Even if her memory was fully restored, she believed that Dan Shu would not resent Rong Huijin. After all, he was the man she had personally nurtured, who had been with her, and the only man she had truly loved in her short 30 years of life but had not been able to have a good ending. Nan 11 was silent for a while, and suddenly she didn't know what she thought of, and her brows were slightly twisted. Jean Rouault should not have any memory of the previous life. When he saw her for the first time just now, his reaction didn't seem to be like he had any memory. The tone of his voice to confirm her identity and the inquiring look that fell on her face for a short time had already shown that he probably didn't remember her face very well. But the tone of his voice was clearly not unfamiliar at all. Although he was willful, it was also a kind of willfulness in front of people he cared about. Rong Yu hummed, "He really has no memory." Nan 11 was slightly surprised, "So he knows my existence only because he is good at fortune-telling and can predict things in past and present lives?" That should be right. Rong Yu's tone was a little indifferent, as if he had little interest in this person. Except for being more willful and domineering, Jean Rouault is indeed good in other aspects. The rumors in the world are all true and not exaggerated. Nan 11 said, "Oh, thinking that the world is so big that there are all kinds of strange things. The legends of strange people do not exist entirely in the records of unofficial history. However, if it was just because he could predict past and present lives, it didn't seem reasonable for him to call her sister as soon as he came. After all, no memory means no feelings. How can you take the initiative to get close to others without feelings?" Nan 11 thought about Jean Rouault's threats before he left, and wanted to ask Rong Yu if he should respond. When she looked up at Rong Yu, she obviously noticed that he was in a bad mood, with a slightly frown between his eyebrows, as if he was lost in some thoughts. Nan 11 guessed that he must have remembered some things in the past, and subconsciously wanted to comfort him, but she didn't want to disturb his thoughts at the moment, so she just sat quietly leaning against the brocade couch. "Why don't you talk?" Rong Yu noticed the sudden silence in the atmosphere, raised his eyes slightly, looked at the quiet Nan 11, and stretched out his hand to hold her in his arms. "Are you in a bad mood?" Nan 11 looked at him. "You should be the one in a bad mood." Rong Yu was startled, and his eyes narrowed slightly. "Jean Rouault's words just now were just to scare you. He won't do anything to hurt you." Nan 11 pondered for a moment. "Rong Yu, you are hesitating now, how to deal with the relationship between this person and me. She is really a sharp and transparent girl." Rong Yu sighed, gently rested his chin on her shoulder, and said in a low voice, "If he insists on staying with you, then I will give him a prince as the queen's brother, so that he won't be wronged. This is the best solution he can think of. Entering the harem is impossible. Even if there will be no relationship between them, even if they were blood siblings in the previous life, it is not possible. He is 2 years older than me, let him be the Empress's brother." Nan 11 frowned. "Isn't this very strange?" "Let him be your brother," Rong Yu frowned. "Wouldn't this be even more strange?" Nan 11 was speechless for a moment. She actually wanted to say that she had no intention of leaving Prince Jean Rouault in Dongling, but this matter seemed to be beyond her decision. Jean Rouault came all the way here, obviously it was impossible for him to have no intention, and although Rong Yu was reluctant, he obviously did not intend to drive Jean Rouault away. So she felt that Rong Yu and Jean Rouault seemed to be the two protagonists in this love-hate story. Fortunately, Rong Yu was not in a high mood at the moment and didn't know what she was thinking. Otherwise, he would have immediately executed her on the spot and let her experience who is in love with whom and who is killing whom. At this time, on the moat bridge outside the palace, Jean Rouault was standing against the railing with his ferret in his arms. The evening breeze blew his robe, and the beautiful and cold-proof fox fur could not stop the cold wind pouring into his heart. What's even colder is a cold and hurt heart. Dongling is indeed a group of treacherous foxes. Jean Rouault's eyes fell on the distant sky, and his tone was hateful. "We promised that we could have a stove and drink tea, but in such a cold weather, I was asked to go out and suffer from the cold? Damn it. Wrong Huijin. Damn Xiejin. I don't share the same feelings with you. Isn't Prince Zanruo going to gather troops and create chaos in the world? Xiejin walked out of the palace with Xianyu and Yao. He saw a familiar figure standing on the bridge from a distance. He was a little surprised and gave up his plan to go to the carriage. Walk directly to the bridge. Why is a person standing here blowing the evening breeze and watching the sunset? Is it possible that he is nostalgic for the last scene before Dongling was destroyed? Zanruo turned his head and looked at him coldly. Diao, bite him. Hearing this, the ferret in his arms instantly jumped out of his arms and flew towards Xiejin like a bolt of snow-white lightning, grabbing the overly handsome face. Hey, Xianyu and Yao stretched out his hand to stop the ferret's attack in time. What are you doing? The ninth master of the Xie family relies on this face to travel around the world and attract girls. If you dare to scratch his appearance, be careful of him. Take the fur off your body and make it a collar. After that, he added, skin alive. Window. Tabula equals window. Tabula. Tabula.push, mode, thumbs feed -01, container. Tabula below article thumbnail -300x250, placement, below article thumbnail -300x250, target. Type, mix. The regent is a yandere who needs to be pampered. Author, Nan Huang. Chapter 454. Zhanruo stretched out his hand, and the snow mink obediently jumped back into his arms, pulling at his clothes and making two low noises, as if accusing. Relying on this face to travel the world and attract peach blossoms, Zhanruo smiled coldly, and his eyes fell in front of Xiejin with deep meaning. The ninth master of the Xie family is romantic and passionate, and has countless concubines, but unfortunately no one can give you a child. You are destined to be alone in this life and die alone. What is there to be proud of? After saying this, he stood up and walked towards the palace gate. Where are you going? Xianyu and Yao asked curiously. Didn't this man say that he wanted to leave Dongling and start a war to plunge Dongling into war? Zhanruo said without turning his head, I am a distinguished guest of Dongling. I can go wherever I want. You have no right to control me. What a child who deserves a beating. Xianyu and Yao frowned and looked at the man's back unhappily. However, thinking of what he just said, he turned his head suspiciously and looked at Xiejin, alone and lonely for the rest of your life. What does that mean? Does he mean that you will never have children in this life? Xiejin raised his eyes and looked at him. That should be what he meant. You are just spreading rumors to confuse the public. Xianyu and Yao sneered, or do you want to curse you on purpose? As expected, you deserve to be killed. Xiejin said nothing, his eyebrows and eyes were gloomy. Zhanruo returned to the palace and found that he had nowhere to go. As a guest, he didn't even have a place to stay for the time being. Only the mink in his arms accompanied him to blow the cold wind in the freezing weather. It's really pitiful to think about it. Zhanruo walked while cursing angrily, damn wrong Huijin, you are really spoiled by my sister. You only know how to hide behind women and act like a turtle. Do you really think I dare not do anything to you? If it weren't for my sister's face, I would definitely let you die on the battlefield, accompanied by yellow dust and countless corpses for the rest of your life. The snow mink in his arms probably felt his depressed mood and squeaked twice to comfort him. Zhanruo sighed and touched Minoer's head. What do you think I should do? In fact, I shouldn't have come to Dongling this time, right? Anyway, my sister doesn't remember me. She only has the heinous wrong Huijin in her heart. Why should I come to her and make myself unhappy? But I really can't bear it when I think about it. Why can the culprit who killed her in the previous life get what he wants in this life? Just because of his deep love? The people who were killed by him in the previous life died in vain? In his previous life, he was willful, overbearing, selfish, and self-willed, which led to the instability of the country and the turmoil of the society. How many people were implicated because of him? How many innocent people died tragically? Why can all these sins be written off because of death? If death can wash away sins, does it mean that death can also erase the relationship that should not have existed? He caused his elder sister to die early, the country was in turmoil, and his elder sister didn't even leave a child to inherit the throne. Why can he still enjoy his elder sister's love for him like nothing happened? The more Jean Rouault thought about it, the angrier he became. The more he thought about it, the more he felt that Rong Huijin was a cunning fox. He entangled his elder sister step by step, made her fall in love with him, and used that broken dream to make her feel guilty about him. When her elder sister loved him deeply, he would reveal the truth bit by bit, so that her elder sister couldn't bear to blame him. It was simply sinister and cunning. The more Jean Rouault thought about it, the angrier he got. He unconsciously put more strength into his hand holding the ferret, which frightened the ferret so much that it shrank in his arms and dared not move. He endured the pain of being strangled, fearing that he would touch the master's nerve that was about to catch fire. Until a gentle voice sounded from the side, breaking the increasingly fierce anger at this time, Prince Jean Rouault. Jean Rouault came back to his senses, stopped at the same time, and looked up at the person walking in front of the palace corridor, Prime Minister Su. Does Prince Jean Rouault know me? Su Shang was slightly surprised. I remember we have never met. It's your honor that I know you, Jean Rouault said in a light tone, but it's my bad luck that you know me. After saying that, he raised his foot and brushed past him, obviously not wanting to talk more. Su Chang was stunned, obviously not expecting him to have such a bad temper. She turned around and said, Prince Jean Rouault. Jean Rouault stopped and turned to look at him. Do you know why I said you know me? It's my bad luck. Su Chang smiled faintly. Jean Rouault is not happy to see me. Would you be happy to see a dead person in broad daylight? Su Chang's face changed slightly. What does Prince Jean Rouault mean? It means you are going to die soon, Jean Rouault said impatiently. After death, the place you go is the underworld. The breath of the dead carries a gloomy death. This is why I don't want to see you, so stay away from me. After leaving the sentence, he walked away, as if he wanted to stay away from him. No matter how good-tempered Su Chang was, his face was a little ugly at this time. Looking at his back that seemed to be eager to leave something dirty, he frowned and said, Prince Jean Rouault and I have no grudges in the past or today. Why did the prince curse me like this? He thought that Prince Jean Rouault from Yu country would be a gentle and elegant gentleman, a hermit who was indifferent to fame and fortune, and a banished immortal who was not stained by the dust. He didn't expect that the other party would be such a man with a bad temper and a sharp tongue. Curse! Jean Rouault was furious for a moment, turned his head and looked at him coldly. You are the one who cursed, your whole family is cursed. This prince is telling you that your death is coming. Go back and prepare a better coffin for yourself as soon as possible. Is this a curse? Can't you tell what is a curse and what is a prophecy? I tell you, you can say that this prince is not good looking, but if you question this prince's ability, I will let you die faster. Humph. Jean Rouault said something furious and left without looking back, leaving Su Chang standing alone on the palace corridor with a stiff face, letting the cold wind blow and keeping silent. Is his death coming soon? Su Chang couldn't help but clench his hands, annoyed that this person was so outspoken, but there was also an inexplicable uneasiness quietly fermenting. He lifted his sleeves and smelled it. A gloomy deathly aura? The sleeves of his robe were clean and had a light scent of agar wood, so how could there be any deathly aura? However, although Yu State was small, Yu State Prince Jean Rouault was born with supernatural powers, good at divination, prediction, and never told lies. Su Chang's face changed little by little. He originally came here to ask whether the attack on Dongling by several countries was true or false, but he didn't expect that he had no chance to ask at all, and was directly sentenced to death by Jean Rouault, whom he met for the first time. The regent is a yandere who needs to be pampered. Author, Nan Huang. Chapter 455. Jean Rouault wandered around the palace alone. He wanted to go to the Dajhan palace countless times but couldn't bring himself to do it. So he went to the imperial garden instead. Unexpectedly, he soon welcomed another uninvited guest. The regent king had given instructions in advance, and Siejin had already told the commander of the imperial guards, so as long as Jean Rouault didn't do anything bad, he could go wherever he wanted, so no one cared about him. But Duan Muyu had already inquired about his whereabouts. When he came out of the palace, it was already dark. The temperature in the air dropped sharply, and it was even colder than in the palace, making people shiver. He was wearing a thick black fur cloak, and the whole person was wrapped tightly, but even so, he was still so cold that he couldn't help but tighten his collar. At one point, he almost wanted to give up the plan to go to the imperial garden to find Jean Rouault. He was afraid of the cold. The weather was too cold for him these 2 days. He caught a cold a few days ago and lay in bed for 2 or 3 days. After the empress learned about it, she felt very sorry and ordered the palace servants to send him charcoal fire. Only then did he feel better these 2 nights. After taking a few doses of decoction, his condition improved slightly today, but Duan Muyu didn't care about his physical discomfort and couldn't wait to know the current situation of various countries. He had a lot of things to ask Jean Rouault. Have the northern frontier and South Vietnam really led troops to attack? Who led the troops in the northern frontier? The 6th prince? The emperor of South Vietnam is going to marry the queen of Dongling? And the regent of Ziki, Lin Ao? Duan Muyu has been living in the palace for a while, and he is isolated from the news. What he cares most about is the political situation in the northern frontier. But it is so far away from him that it is not easy for him to know the situation in the northern frontier. He can't ask others these questions, only Jean Rouault can give him the answers. Duan Muyu wanted to know too many things, and he didn't want to wait any longer, so he found an opportunity and came directly. He arrived at the imperial garden in the cold wind, walked along the palace corridor and asked the palace servants all the way, and then found Jean Rouault in the huge imperial garden. The palace lanterns in the plum garden were bright. The young man in the cloud-colored cloak stood in the forest. His figure was slender and light. From a distance, it was unclear whether the plum blossoms blooming on the branches were more holy and flawless, or the cloak on his body was more cool and clean. Duan Muyu raised his hand to signal the guards following him to stop, walked towards the plum forest alone, and stood 5 or 6 steps behind Jean Rouault, Prince Jean Rouault. Jean Rouault, who was thinking about life, frowned, unhappy that someone always disturbed him. He turned around and looked at the uninvited people irritably. Are you done? You didn't give me a penny, but you always want to ask me questions. Aren't you annoying? Duan Muyu didn't have time to say anything, and was stunned by the gunpowder-like words. After a while, he finally smiled faintly. Prince Jean Rouault is in a bad mood. Jean Rouault glanced at him. Do you have medicine to cure bad mood? Duan Muyu choked. The little prince doesn't, but dash. The emperor of northern frontier is considering appointing another prince. Jean Rouault restrained his anger and suddenly smiled meaningfully. Why doesn't Prince Duan Muyu go back earlier to save the situation? Duan Muyu's face changed. What did you say? This prince never likes to repeat the same thing twice. Jean Rouault snorted coldly and gently stroked. He looked at the ferret in his arms. If you can understand, then understand. If you can't, it's none of my business. Don't bother me. Duan Muyu clenched his hands, and a faint smile rose at the corner of his mouth. The little prince has only been away from the northern frontier for more than a month, and he came here by order. There is no reason for the emperor to appoint another crown prince. Who said there is no reason? Jean Rouault looked at him with pity. You set off from the northern frontier in mid-November, and it has been almost 2 months today. Don't you know how many things can happen in 2 months? What's more, your brothers are on par with you, and they are all eyeing the throne. If they find out that you are colluding with others and treason, do you think they will do nothing? I'm afraid they will definitely take the opportunity to pull you down from the crown prince position. Colluding with others, treason, Duan Muyu's face suddenly changed. What do you mean by this? Who did the little prince collude with, and who did he collude with? Jean Rouault frowned and looked at him unhappily. Are you questioning me? His tone was really bad. Yu State is just a small country. Beijiang only needs 50,000 soldiers to swallow up Yu State in an instant. As a prince of Yu State, Jean Rouault really doesn't know where he got the confidence to talk to the prince of Beijiang like this. But people have to bow their heads under the eaves. Duan Muyu took a deep breath, suppressed the intense emotions surging in his heart, and said in a gentle tone, "My prince is too anxious, I hope Prince Jean Rouault will forgive me." "Forgive?" Jean Rouault said indifferently, "I have no obligation to forgive you." Duan Muyu choked again, "That's not what I meant. My prince just wants to ask Prince Jean Rouault about treason. Should Prince Jean Rouault be joking with me? You are so beautiful, is this prince interested in joking with you?" Jean Rouault frowned more and more, thinking that this person was simply sick. If there is nothing else, don't block my way. So annoying. He couldn't even enjoy the plum blossoms, and there were always annoying flies to disturb him. Jean Rouault turned around and was about to leave, but Duan Muyu didn't want to let him go, so he stretched out his hand to stop him. "Prince Jean Rouault, I have some questions to ask you. There is a warm pavilion over there. I wonder if we can sit down and talk." "No. I hope Prince Jean Rouault can give me some face." "Not interested." Prince Jean Rouault. Jean Rouault was annoyed and was about to lose his temper, but he suddenly thought of something. He stared at Duan Muyu in silence for a moment, and said in a light tone, "You can talk if you want." Duan Muyu felt relieved and raised his hand to signal, "Your Highness, please." "Prince Duan Muyu has not seen Her Majesty the Queen for a long time," Jean Rouault said. "As a prince of a country, staying in another country for a long time is a risk. The longer you stay, the greater the risk." Duan Muyu nodded. The prince is right. He had wanted to leave for a long time, but the queen and the regent would not let him go. With the few thousand guards he brought with him, it was not easy to leave Dongling. "Even if we can really leave Dongling safely, what will happen after we leave the border?" Duan Muyu was afraid of death, so he had many worries. But for a person in a high position, living is more important than anything else. Jean Rouault didn't care whether he was afraid of death or not. He just said lightly, "So you should say goodbye to Her Majesty the Queen earlier. It's best to leave Dongling early tomorrow morning." Duan Muyu was silent for a moment and nodded slowly. "The prince is right, Xiao Wang really wants to leave as soon as possible, but Her Majesty the Queen and the regent kindly persuaded Xiao Wang to stay." "Xiao Wang. They are so kind to ask you to stay, so you can't fight for the chance to leave." Jean Rouault frowned, looking at him as if he was looking at an idiot. "If the queen and the regent don't take the initiative to say goodbye, you plan to stay here forever. Go down." "Then you can wait until the end of time," Jean Rouault sneered. "Now they only care about the love between husband and wife. They have thrown you, an unimportant guest, out of the sky. Do you expect them to take the initiative to let you go? Maybe after the change of dynasty in northern Xinjiang, can." Duan Muyu was speechless. Although this prince from Yu Kingdom has a bad temper and his tone of voice is really not pleasant to listen to, what he said is obviously the truth. Window. Tabula equals window. Tabula. Tabula.push, mode, thumbspeed -01, container, tabula below article thumbnail -300x250, placement, below article thumbnail -300x250, target. Type, mix. You are listening to novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. The regent is a yandere who needs to be pampered. Author, Nan Huang. Chapter 456. Staying in Tanglan for one more day means one more risk. Duan Muyu said, I want to know whether it is true or not that the 6th Prince of Northern Xinjiang led troops to force a marriage. Zhan Ruo's eyebrows turned cold. Why should I tell you? Duan Muyu didn't expect that he would fall out at that moment. He was so angry that he couldn't help but frowned. Did Prince Zhanruo eat gunpowder? Yes, Zhanruo sneered. Do you have any objections? Duan Muyu was so choked that he couldn't say a word. Are you going to the Taisho Palace or not? Duan Muyu took a deep breath and said, Go. You can invite me to go with you, Zhanruo said in a calm tone. I am humble enough to reluctantly agree to your invitation. Duan Muyu was silent, and really couldn't figure out his intentions, but since he was willing to go with him, it was naturally the best. If the regent and the queen still insist on not letting him go, maybe Zhanruo can speak from it. With this idea in mind, Duan Muyu stretched out his hand and signaled, Prince Zhanruo, please. Zhanruo hummed and was not polite to him. Shi Shiren put his feet up and walked ahead. Duan Muyu walked beside him, trying to find a topic as he walked. The question that Xiao Wang asked just now, please ask the prince to clarify. What's the problem? The troops leading troops from northern Xinjiang and South Vietnam forced marriage. Duan Muyu frowned slightly. Is the prophecy that whoever wins the Queen of Dongling wins the world true? Zhanruo turned to look at him. What? Do you also want to win the world? Duan Muyu's mood calmed down a bit. Hearing this, a hint of arrogance appeared on his face. Among the men in the world, who doesn't have the ambition to dominate the world? Really? Zhanruo looked him up and down. Sarcasm appeared on the corners of his lips. You are not even qualified to carry Queen Dongling's shoes. How dare you have delusions? As soon as the words fell, Duan Muyu's feet froze, and the arrogance on his face disappeared visibly. Instead, veins popped out on his forehead, and his face was a mixture of green and white, so livid that he could barely conceal his rage. Prince Zhanruo of Yu Kingdom is really capable of angering people to death even if they don't pay for it with their lives. He looked at Zhanruo expressionlessly, clenching the hands hanging by his sides tightly. At that moment, he could hardly control the urge to kill this poisonous-tongued prince. If he were in the palace of northern Xinjiang, at this time, such anger was enough to make all the palace people around him kneel down and beg for mercy. It's a pity that Zhanruo doesn't follow his rules. Are you going to the Dajhan Palace? He asked in a very calm tone. If you don't want to go, please do it yourself. I have other things to do and I am not interested in wasting time here with you. Duan Muyu's cheeks twitched violently a few times, and finally suppressed the anger that hit his lungs, and walked out with a sullen face. Zhanruo said as he walked, I am going with you. Duan Muyu said nothing, his expression still ugly. Did you hear that? Zhanruo frowned and looked at him. I am going with you. Duan Muyu barely suppressed his anger. What exactly do you want to say? I didn't want to say anything, I just wanted to tell you that this prince is going with you. Duan Muyu was so angry that he was not in the mood to discern what he meant, and sneered with a sullen face. To put it this way, I really wronged the prince. It's good that you know. Duan Muyu's face darkened and he no longer wanted to talk to him. He found that talking to this person really required a certain amount of cultivation and concentration, otherwise he might be so angry that he fainted at any time. On the other hand, the initiator seemed not to notice at all that Duan Muyu was beside him and was almost losing his mind due to his anger. He was thinking that it was not him who wanted to go to the Dajhan Palace, but Duan Muyu who invited him to go, even if he had nothing to do. I'm free, just take a walk with him. The two of them walked through the night to the Taisho Palace. Rongyu and Nan 11 are having a meal. Hearing Qin Jiang's report to Duan Muyu asking for an audience, Nan 11 was a little surprised. She subconsciously looked at the sky outside. It's so late, why did Prince Duan Mu come to see me? I don't know. Rong Yu said calmly, who did he come with? Qing Yang said, that Prince Yu of the Yu Kingdom with a very hot temper. Nan 11 frowned, how did they get together? Qing Yang said, I don't know. However, Rong Yu seemed to be unsurprised and calmly peeled off a shrimp and stuffed it into Nan 11's mouth, saying calmly, let them in. Yes. After Nan 11 chewed and swallowed it gracefully, she said, what are they doing? Rong Yu peeled another one for her and said in a calm voice, guess. Nan 11 was enjoying Rong Yu's feeding while thinking hard. However, before she started thinking, Duan Muyu and Zhanruo walked in one after another. They saw Her Majesty the Queen and the Regent having a meal. Both of them were in awe. Stunned. The cold wind along the way has extinguished Duan Muyu's anger. Apart from his face turning blue from the cold, Duan Muyu seemed to be in a good mood. After entering the palace, he bowed slightly and said, I don't know that Her Majesty the Queen is having a meal, so I take the liberty to disturb you, please forgive me, Your Majesty. It doesn't matter, Nan 11 smiled lightly, it's so late. Prince Duanmu and Prince Zhanruo have something to do with me. Zhanruo stared at Rong Yu's movements with unkind eyes. The thorns were picked out from a piece of tender fish meat and tenderly brought to Nan 11's mouth, completely ignoring the presence of outsiders. It was shameless to the extreme. Zhanruo felt angry and almost wanted to step forward and overturn the dining table, but when his eyes touched Nan 11's gentle face with a slight smile, he suppressed his anger and said without changing his expression, I just met Bei in the palace, Prince Zhang, he had to drag me with him, but I didn't want to offend him, so I came with him. Your Majesty can pretend that he didn't see me. Nan 11 raised her eyebrows nonchalantly upon hearing this, really? Zhanruo pretended to be calm and looked down at the white deerskin boots on her feet, yes. Nan 11 said, what does Prince Duanmu want to see me about? I have been in Dongling for a long time, Duanmu said sincerely, thank you for the hospitality of Her Majesty the Queen and the Regent these days. I will remember it in my heart. But before I came here, my father told me to go back early, so I want to leave Dongling early tomorrow morning and return to Northern Frontier as soon as possible. I came here tonight. I bid farewell to His Majesty, and I hope His Majesty will agree. Nan 11 frowned slightly, does the Prince of Northern Frontier dislike my poor hospitality? No, Duanmu had to deny it against his will, Your Majesty's hospitality, I am deeply grateful, and I really have a heavy responsibility, so I dare not delay the time. Nan 11 seemed worried, but it's freezing cold now, I'm afraid it will be inconvenient to travel. That's right, Zhanruo muttered to himself, it's so cold, are you in a hurry to go back to reincarnate? After the voice fell, the hall suddenly fell into a tricky silence. Window. Tabula equals window. Tabula. Tabula.push, mode, thumbs feed -01, container, tabula below article thumbnail -300x250, placement, below article thumbnail -300x250, target. Type, mix. The regent is a yandere who needs to be pampered. Author, Nan Huang. Chapter 457. Duanmuyu's expression turned frozen. He slowly turned his head, looking gloomily at the young man next to him who was as beautiful as an angel but as bad-tempered as a devil, and said coldly, Prince Zhanruo. Zhanruo raised his eyes, what? Duanmu clenched his hands tightly. If he were in the northern Xinjiang imperial city at this time, he would definitely have this damn man pulled down and cut into pieces. In all his life, he has never seen such a shameless bastard that makes one's heart and lungs hurt. Taking the initiative to see this damn thing tonight was actually the biggest mistake he had ever made in his life. He didn't get an answer to the question he originally wanted to ask, and instead felt like a coward. He couldn't figure it out anyway, what kind of environment and soil had brought up such a bastard and shameless thing. The anger rushed to the top of his head, and Duanmu was almost filled with anger. He spent a lot of effort to suppress his anger and said coldly, "Prince Zhanruo is really capable of making people angry to death." Zhanruo raised his eyebrows, "Thank you for the compliment. Only if he could make the shameless regent at the dinner table angry to death would he think it was worth celebrating." "What's wrong?" Nan 11 raised her eyes and looked at their faces. "Did you two have a conflict?" Zhanruo said as if nothing had happened, "The sky is dry and things are dry, so it is normal for Prince Duanmu to have strong anger." Duanmu couldn't help but turn green again. But after all, he didn't want to break up with Zhanruo here. After all, his purpose was just to leave Dongling as soon as possible. So far, nothing was more important than this. As for getting information about the situation in northern Xinjiang from Zhanruo's mouth, it was just a tentative attitude. He didn't want to say it, and Duanmu couldn't pry his mouth open. He just really didn't expect that Prince Zhanruo of the Yu Kingdom, who was rumored to be good at astrology and divination and could predict the future, would actually be so virtuous, which was really disappointing. "If Prince Duanmu insists on leaving, I am not willing to force you to stay." Nan 11 smiled lightly, "But it has been really cold these 2 days. If Prince Duanmu doesn't mind, you can wait until the 15th day of the first lunar month before leaving. You will be 3 days late. 5 days shouldn't have any impact." Duanmu didn't want to wait a day. Waiting one more day meant that his reserve position would be at risk. Moreover, if someone falsely accused him of collaborating with the enemy and treason, the longer it delayed, the worse it would be for him. By then, there would be no room for justification. So he said calmly, "The climate in Dongling is really too cold for Xiao Wang, so I thought of going back early. The cold weather will pass on the way. Your Majesty, don't worry." Nan 11 turned to look at Rong Yu. "What does the regent think?" "Since Prince Duanmu wants to leave, we can't force him to stay," Rong Yu said in a calm tone. "The prince can go back and pack his bags now. I will have someone take you out of the city early tomorrow morning. Your Majesty has a special health, so he will not send Prince Duanmu off in person." Duanmu finally breathed a sigh of relief, nodded and said, "Thank you, Her Majesty the Queen, and thank you, the Regent." After a pause, "The little king will not disturb Your Majesty and the Regent's meal, so I will take my leave." Nan 11 smiled lightly, "I hope Prince Duanmu has a safe journey and returns to northern Xinjiang safely as soon as possible." When Duanmu heard these words, he felt a little uneasy, and his original mood of leaving was immediately diluted. Maybe it was because of what Nan 11 had said before and the threat in Rong Yu's words that he felt uneasy about the journey from Dongling to northern Xinjiang, but now he really couldn't stay in Dongling for a long time. There is no other way but to go back. Duanmu quickly turned around and left. After walking a few steps, he saw Zhanruo standing still and said calmly, "Prince Zhanruo still isn't leaving. What does it matter to you whether this prince leaves or not?" Zhanruo glared at him and walked to the dining table. "I want to eat too." Duanmu was stunned. What does this mean? The co-authored Prince Zhanruo was reincarnated as a starving ghost? Nan 11's attitude was gentle, as if the unpleasantness in the afternoon had never happened before, and she smiled slightly and said, "If Prince Zhanruo doesn't mind, you can sit down and eat together." Zhanruo sat unceremoniously on her right side. Well, Rong Yu is sitting on the left side of Nan 11. As a result, the scene suddenly became a little subtle. Duanmu frowned and looked at Zhanruo's familiar posture suspiciously. He vaguely came back to his senses. How dare this person repeatedly emphasize that he came with him tonight? What's his true intention? What is his relationship with Queen Dongling? Sitting next to the Queen in such a majestic place, aren't you worried that Rong Yu will tear him into pieces? Thinking like this, Duanmu glanced at Rong Yu, but saw that Rong Yu didn't seem to have any reaction. He couldn't help but think deeply in his heart. Prince Zhanruo and the regent were also old acquaintances. However, this question will definitely not be answered for the time being. When Duanmu turned to leave, he could not help but have many speculations in his mind. Thinking of what Jean Rouault said a moment ago, "You are not worthy of carrying Queen Dongling's shoes," his thoughts became deeper. It was certain that he was being plotted by the Prince of the Yu Kingdom tonight. As Duan Muyu thought about it, he couldn't help but become more and more angry. He thought to himself that after returning to northern Xinjiang to resolve his own affairs, he would definitely find a way to teach Yu Guo a lesson so that Jean Rouault would regret today's rude provocation against him. Duan Muyu gathered up his thick cloak and left in the cold wind. Jean Rouault in the palace concealed all his awkward and uncomfortable emotions and commanded the palace maid openly, "I want to eat shrimps too. Come and peel two for me." The maid saw him sitting boldly next to Her Majesty the Queen. Neither the Queen nor the regent said anything, so naturally they would not disobey his orders. They were about to come over to serve him, but Rong Yu said calmly, "You have no skills yourself. My hands are delicate and were born to be served, just like my sister." Jean Rouault looked at him coldly, "Unlike you, you were born to be a servant, you deserve to be a slave." As soon as the words fell, the warm air in the palace seemed to be 3 points colder in an instant. The palace maids were frightened and silent. Saying such words to the powerful regent is undoubtedly a great rebellion, and he should be dragged down and beaten to death. Even if he is the Prince of Yu, such words are disrespectful. However, Rong Yu's face was calm as usual, and he calmly picked a piece of tender meat and put it to Nan 11's mouth. Obviously, he didn't care about someone's childish provocation. But just because he didn't care, it didn't mean Nan 11 didn't care either. "If Prince Jean Rouault continues to speak ill of the regent, I can't keep you in Dongling." Nan 11's smile faded, and her tone was light, "The regent is my husband. Husband and wife are one. If he is a slave, what am I?" Jean Rouault's face changed. "Sister, you are of noble status, and you are not the same as him." "No," Nan 11 emphasized, "he and I are husband and wife, and husband and wife are always equal, regardless of superiority or inferiority." Jean Rouault frowned. "Sister, what you said is not right. No one in the world can be equal to the king, even husband and wife. There are many deposed queens in history. If they are all equal, why should the queen call herself concubine in front of the emperor, and why is the fate of life and death in the hands of the king? The regent is a yandere who needs to be pampered." Author, Nan Huang. Chapter 458. Nan 11 was silent for a moment. "You are the Prince of Yu State, I am the Queen of Dongling, we are not related, you should not call me elder sister, I am not your elder sister." After that, she added lightly, "Besides, the age is not appropriate." Jean Rouault was stunned, and a trace of hurt flashed across Nan 11's eyes. The originally cold and white skin suddenly became as white as paper, and the beautiful face seemed to lose all its luster in an instant and became dull. Nan 11 saw him like this, and felt reluctant for a while. Although they had only been in contact for less than a day, she knew that this young man did not come with malicious intent. He was just straightforward and a little poisonous. Whether it was his attitude towards her or what Rong Yu had said, it was enough to prove that they had a deep relationship in the previous life. It can even be said that Dan Shu's position in his heart as a sister cannot be replaced by anyone. If Nan 11 still had the memory of her past life, then based on Dan Shu's feelings for this brother, she might just scold him and warn him for his careless words, but in this situation, Nan 11 had no position to teach him a lesson. Because she really couldn't treat him as her own brother. She knew that Rong Yu tolerated him because Rong Yu had Rong Huijin's memory, and he did have an unshirkable responsibility for the country of Dongling, and he was willing to pay the price for the mistakes he had made, so no matter whether it was the punishment given to him by the high priest or Jean Rouault's bad attitude towards him, he silently endured it. However, he could endure it, but Nan 11 couldn't. Rong Yu had endured enough in his past and present lives, and he had swallowed so much pain alone, and never complained. All he wanted in his past and present lives was to get what he wanted with his deep love. Compared with those men who were eager for fame and fortune, Rong Yu really didn't ask for much. Nan 11 couldn't let him bear more accusations. Even if they really want to blame, what happened 200 years ago was only between Rong Huijin and Dan Shu. Only Rong Huijin and Dan Shu have the right to judge it. No matter how close they are, others have no right to interfere too much. So even if it might hurt him, Nan 11 would not let him continue to speak ill of Rong Yu. Yin Yu Nan 11 said, "Let everyone leave." Yin Yu nodded silently, made a gesture, and the palace people lowered their eyebrows and eyes and left. Zhanruo, I occasionally remember some things in the previous life, but whether it is Rong Huijin in the previous life or Rong Yu in this life, he is loved by people. Nan 11 looked at Zhanruo. Dan Shu in the previous life was willing to take responsibility and blame for him. In this life, Nan 11 has no regrets to be protected by him and is happy to be a carefree little girl. Whether it is Nan 11 or Dan Shu, there may be times when they are helpless in their feelings, but their feelings have never been false, and they never want to let him down. Zhanruo didn't speak, his eyes were slightly narrowed, and his expression was stunned. The past is over. Even if you cut him into pieces now, what can be changed? Nan 11 frowned slightly. Can you revive Dan Shu from 200 years ago? Since the things that happened 200 years ago are over, why do you still let him control your life and come back to be the Empress of Dongling? Zhanruo said calmly. Sister Dan Shu's wish before her death was to be an ordinary woman, to take care of her husband and children, and no longer be bound by the world and responsibilities, but you still return to Dongling. Because Rong Huijin was not the only one who did wrong in the previous life, and Rong Huijin was not the only one who was ashamed of the country. Dan Shu also needs to make up for her mistakes. Nan 11 said calmly, I am not controlled by him, but now the days of returning to Dongling are not forced or reluctant for me. I am willing to come back, even if there are some reasons for Rong Yu. In the end, it is because I have the blood of the Dongling royal family. And the days of returning to Dongling are actually more comfortable than those in Dezhou. It seemed that the responsibility of a country was on her shoulders, but Rong Yu had already made the most careful arrangements in all aspects. As an empress, she did not have any burden. The power was in her hands, but all the major affairs of the court were controlled by Rong Yu, and she did not need to worry at all. Rong Yu never hid anything from her. He would discuss government affairs with her, mostly in a relaxed and casual way, never put pressure on her, and her opinions usually coincided with his. Out of absolute respect, Rong Yu would neither hide anything from her nor add extra burdens to her, nor would he make her worry. Whether it was the young upstarts he had already conquered or the important officials in the court, he could rule them all obediently, but he had to give her the opportunity to show favor and establish his authority, which invisibly accumulated majesty for her as an empress. Nan 11 did not think that any man in the world could be as meticulous and strong as Rong Yu, who could handle everything in a comprehensive manner and protect her tightly. So what if she made 1,000 mistakes in her past life? Is she going to hold on to her past mistakes and let Rong Yu, who has already had a hard life in this life, endure more torture and suffering? So your Majesty returned to Dongling voluntarily, and fell in love with this person voluntarily, and will never regret it in this life. Zhanruo looked at her, his eyes never blinking, as if to confirm her feelings, even if he has done a lot of wrong things. Nan 11 said in a light tone, there is nothing to regret. Zhanruo was silent for a moment, and nodded slowly, I know. Zhanruo Prince Ruo. I took the liberty of coming here uninvited. Zhanruo stood up, took a few steps back, and bowed deeply to express his apology. To paraphrase Duan Muyu, I hope that Her Majesty the Queen and the Prince Regent will bear with you. Nan 11 frowned. Rong Yu put down his chopsticks and adjusted the sleeves of his robe slowly, with an expression that was difficult to distinguish between happiness and anger. I will go back to Yu country soon, and I will try my best not to set foot in Dongling again. Your Majesty, what I said in the afternoon will be regarded as my fart. Zhanruo narrowed his eyes, his voice was calm, and there was no more explosion. Mao's anger, I'll say goodbye. After speaking, he gave a slow salute, then turned around and walked out without looking back. Nan 11 stood up, Zhanruo. Zhanruo paused slightly, hesitated for a moment, then turned to look at Nan 11, is there anything else, Your Majesty? Stay in the palace tonight. It's freezing outside, so don't run around. Zhanruo shook his head and smiled lightly, this palace has left me with too many unforgettable memories. I'm afraid I'll have nightmares at night, so I won't stay here. Thank you for your kindness. Nan 11's heart sank, and she watched helplessly as he stepped out of the palace door and quickly disappeared into the night. Window. Tabula equals window. Tabula. Tabula.push, mode, thumbspeed -01, container, tabula below article thumbnail -300x250, placement, below article thumbnail -300x250, target. Type, mix. You are listening to novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. The regent is a yandere who needs to be pampered. Author, Nan Huang. Chapter 459. When Zhanruo turned and left, she had an illusion. He seemed to be crying. Nan 11 stood silently, not knowing what to do. 11 don't worry, Rong Yu's voice was low, and no emotion could be heard. You go back to the inner hall to rest first, I'll go see him. Nan 11 turned to look at him, frowned and said, you go. Rong Yu nodded nonchalantly, there's nothing between men that can't be solved by fighting. He needs to vent now, I'll go and vent with him. Nan 11 seemed to understand what he meant, nodded but did not forget to explain, then don't be stupid again, pay attention to protect yourself. Rong Yu knew that she was worried that the incident in the priest's hall would happen again, and laughed, don't worry, can't I deal with a little brat? Nan 11 hummed. Rong Yu accompanied her into the inner hall, covered her legs with a blanket, poured her a cup of hot water, turned around and took the book on the bedside and gave it to her. If you are bored, read a book for a while, let Yin Yu and Yin Chuang come in to accompany you, I will be back soon. Nan 11 carefully reminded her again, don't hurt him, and don't hurt yourself. Rong Yu lowered his head and kissed her forehead, I know. After saying that, he turned and walked out. Nan 11 leaned against the window, turned her head and looked at the night outside the window, and just wanted to sigh for a while. She was thinking, if this Zhanruo had such a temper in his previous life, would Dan Shu be so angry that she wanted to beat him to death? Zhanruo didn't cry. Wouldn't it be too embarrassing for a man to cry for such a thing? He just regretted it. He regretted saying such a decisive thing as soon as he stepped into the Dajhan palace in the afternoon, so that he couldn't make amends later. He regretted his attitude towards Rong Yu, which led Nan 11 to turn against him in order to protect Rong Yu. Although he still felt disgusted when he saw Rong Yu, he could actually conceal his disgust and it was not difficult to suppress his emotions. At worst, he could make things difficult for him behind his back. Anyway, no matter how powerful Rong Yu was, he didn't have the ability to predict the future. If he, a fortune teller, really wanted to deal with him, he had many ways to do it. The more Zhanruo thought about it, the more he regretted his impulsiveness. Knowing that Nan 11 didn't remember him now, but was in love with Rong Yu, it was reasonable for him to protect Rong Yu, but he insisted on confronting Rong Yu head-on. It shouldn't be surprising to get such a result. If he could resist the impulse for a while, he wouldn't be embarrassed now. But he just couldn't accept it. The more he thought about it, the more unwilling he felt. However, when the cold wind blew, he suddenly realized that even if he was unwilling, what did it matter? He came all the way to Dongling, not to quarrel with Nan 11, and certainly not to break them up. In fact, he knew better than anyone that they loved each other deeply in their previous life but did not have a happy ending. In this life, they finally got together, and no one could break them up. If they could be separated, not to mention Rongyu going crazy, Nan 11 would also be in pain. How could he watch his sister fall into pain? But the current situation made him completely at a loss as to what to do. The relationship had already become strained, and he could not go back again with a sullen face, otherwise he would look down on himself. Jeanruo walked alone in the palace, the cold wind blowing on his face, the biting cold, and he felt more and more that he was a poor creature that no one cared about. He came to Dongling eagerly, but ended up in such a situation. It was really ironic. "Prince Jeanruo, are you going to leave the palace?" A cold voice suddenly sounded behind him. Jeanruo's steps froze suddenly. He turned his head and looked coldly at Rongyu who had come behind him without knowing when. "Are you following me?" Rongyu walked closer with his hands behind his back, wearing a black robe and looking cold and noble. "This palace is now ruled by your majesty and me. I can go wherever I want in the palace. Don't you think it's ridiculous for the prince to say this?" Jeanruo sneered, "It's really ridiculous to occupy the magpie's nest." Rongyu's eyebrows were cold. "I have experienced too many things in my life, mountains of swords and seas of fire, hell and abyss. What kind of battles have I not seen? Even if you stand up with thorns, you can't. It won't hurt me at all, but will only make the people you care about stay away from you." Jeanruo was hit by him, and his face darkened instantly. "Isn't this what you want? My wish is that 11er can be happy and worry-free for life." Rongyu looked at him without any emotion. "As for you, you are not worthy of my heart." Jeanruo was provoked by him and couldn't help but get angry again, but heard Rongyu said casually, "Are you going to leave the palace?" Jeanruo said coldly, "So what? Stay in an inn or a brothel?" Jeanruo was furious when he heard this. He, a noble and unparalleled prince of Yu state, was reduced to spending the night in a brothel? "But at your walking speed, I'm afraid you'll run into the palace ban before you even reach the palace gate." Rongyu's expression was indifferent. "The palace gate is locked, you can't leave even if you want to." "What do you mean?" Jeanruo said angrily. "Are you saying that I'm deliberately delaying?" Rongyu raised the corner of his lips slightly, as if mocking. "I'm just reminding you that if you want to leave the palace, you have to hurry up and don't miss the time." Jeanruo's face was gloomy, and he wanted to beat his noble face into a pig's head. "Do you want to fight?" Rongyu lowered his eyes and calmly and elegantly straightened his robe sleeves. "I haven't exercised for a long time, and I can give you a chance to vent tonight. If you have the ability, you may be able to take the opportunity to kill me to relieve your hatred." Jeanruo narrowed his eyes. "Do you think I dare not kill you?" Rongyu said indifferently, "Whether I dare or not, you will know after I start fighting." Jeanruo sneered, and his body flashed, rushing towards the quiet and deserted imperial garden. "If you lose, just don't go to His Majesty and cry and complain." Rongyu did not comment, and followed him. The wind was howling, and the murderous aura was chilling. The masters obviously did not have so many hypocritical etiquette when fighting, and they started fighting directly after entering the imperial garden. As fast as a meteor, as fast as lightning. The two figures flew like shadows in the night, fiercely countering each move. Each move was full of murderous aura. Stepping on the branches of the corridor, the hem of the robe rustled, the withered branches in winter were swept by the strong wind, the gravel shot, the branches broke, the two figures crossed, and it was almost impossible to tell who was with whom. The wide and deserted garden was invaded by war, and the garden that was originally kept clean and tidy soon became a mess. "I've wanted to teach you a lesson for a long time," Jeanruo said coldly while taking action. "I don't know how many times I have thought about it in my past and present lives. Now I finally have the chance, so you can die." Rongyu's figure flew up lightly, and he stepped on the thin treetops to gain leverage. His expression was obviously much calmer than Jeanruo's. When did you start to recover your memory? What does it have to do with you? Jean-Rouault threw away the cloak that was in the way, and his figure flew over like a rock with wings spread. A branch that he had casually broken turned into a sharp weapon in his hand, and he chopped towards Rongyu fiercely. Just be prepared to kneel down and beg for mercy tonight. Rongyu sneered, children are really naive and ignorant. Even their dreams are unrealistic. Window. Tabula equals window. Tabula. Tabula.push, mode, thumbs feed -01, container, tabula below article thumbnail -300x250, placement, below article thumbnail -300x250, target. Type, mix. The regent is a yandere who needs to be pampered. Author, Nan Huang. Chapter 460. Jean-Rouault was so irritated by him that his moves became more and more fierce. He raised his hand and struck at Rongyu, suffer death. Rongyu could handle him with one hand. As he said, he was just dealing with an ignorant child. Jean-Rouault was filled with anger and wished he could slap Rongyu into the soil and step on him a few times. However, thinking about it, even though he tried his best, he still couldn't reach even one of Rongyu's hair, so he went to the imperial garden. Innocent flowers, plants, and trees suffered. The imperial guard soon gathered outside the garden. Commander Yang, who heard the commotion, thought that an assassin had entered the palace and hurried there with his men. Unexpectedly, he saw the regent and the prince of Yuqing fighting fiercely. The chaos in front of him was, as if the entire garden had been ravaged by a strong wind. However, looking at the battle, it was obvious that the regent had the upper hand. Jean-Rouault was like a furious and irritated leopard. He only knew how to launch a fierce offensive without even breathing, but he could not even touch a corner of Rongyu's robe. After fighting like this for half an hour, the strength was too much and the offensive obviously stagnated. Rongyu found an opportunity and knocked him to the ground. Before Jean-Rouault could get up, he stepped on him with his black deerskin boots. On his chest. Commander Yang saw this and was about to take him up, but saw Rongyu turning his head and looking over. Get back. Commander Yang stopped halfway, raised his hand, and everyone retreated. Rongyu was condescending, looking at the motionless person lying on the ground, and said in a cold tone, not only have you wanted to kill me, but I have also been bored with you for a long time. If it weren't for 11ER's sake, do you have a chance to step into this imperial city? Zanru was completely exhausted, lying on the ground and looking up at the night sky. So what if we step into the imperial city? Aren't I protecting you wholeheartedly? She doesn't even remember him at all. My wife, if she doesn't protect me, will she protect you? Rongyu put down his feet and said in a cold voice, if you have the ability, marry a wife who can protect you. Jean-Rouault couldn't help but get angry again when he heard this, and sat up immediately. That's my sister. Rongyu said coldly, that is my king's wife. Zanruo gritted his teeth, you are so shameless. To each other. Zanruo's face was stiff, and after a long while he said, you brought Sister A to Dongling, do you think it's fair to her? What kind of result do you think is fair to her? Rongyu said indifferently, be an ordinary woman and run around for daily necessities. Or stay in the boudoir, never leave the house or step out, and abide by the 3 obedience and 4 virtues set by others for her? Or, marry a powerful man and indulge in the jealousy and intrigue between wives and concubines? Zanruo was speechless for a moment. Sister, I don't want to scheming with others. Whether you are a man or a woman, only by holding great power and sitting in a most noble position can you shut up all those with malicious intentions. Rongyu put his hands behind his hands, his voice was extremely cold and arrogant, she has become the most noble woman in the world. No one dares to ridicule her, no one dares to make provocations and make trouble for no reason. She does not need to run for a living, and does not need to be bound by any rules. This is true freedom, unfettered and free to do as she pleases. Zanruo couldn't refute. Indeed, the rules in the world are too harsh on women. Only by sitting at the top and holding great power can we do whatever we want to the greatest extent. But she still shouldered the responsibility for all the people in the world. I will bear the responsibility, Rong Yu said. I will also shield her from the storms outside, so that she will not be hurt or wronged at all. This is the best result. It sounds nice, Zhan Ruoleng said. Actually, you are just selfish and want to take sister as your own. You are right about this. Rong Yu raised her lips, with a sinister look on her face. I am selfish, I want her to belong to me alone, and no one else can covet her. No one dares to spy on my wife. A dead end. Like killing those royal wives 200 years ago. Rong Yu's voice was cold. I can do it more cruelly than I did 200 years ago. Of course you can. Zhan Ruo sat up, with a sneer on his lips. In the past, you dared to kill everyone relying on sister's protection, but in the end you were unable to clean up the mess, causing sister Yinghua to die prematurely. Now the whole world, everything is under your control. Of course you can do whatever you want. Who dares to go against your will? Rong Yu was silent for a moment, and his voice was calm. It's good that you know. I have a question for you. What? Will you let sister completely recover her memories of the past? Won't. Why? Rong Yu pursed her thin lips slightly. Those bad memories are meaningless when I think about them. He only hoped that 11er would be happy in the following days, and there was no need to dwell on the pain that had long gone. Zhan Ruo sneered. You are afraid. Rong Yu glanced at him emotionlessly. You are really childish. Zhan Ruo gritted his teeth. Rong Yu straightened her robe sleeves and walked out of the imperial garden. If you want to leave, you can go with Duan Mu early tomorrow morning. Who said I want to leave? Zhan Ruo stood up. I want to stay. I want to see my sister every day, eat, drink tea, chat with her every day, and tell her some important things in the world. Even if she can't remember me, she will accept her feelings for me sooner or later. If you want to die, I can help you at any time, Rong Yu said in a cold voice. I can guarantee that your death will not have any impact on 11er. Zhan Ruo was hit in the heart, and his face turned blue in anger. How dare you? Rong Yu was too lazy to pay attention to his childish words, and walked away from the imperial garden calmly. Back to the Dajhan Palace, the lights were bright. Rong Yu did not go in immediately, but stood alone in the palace corridor for a while, looking at the figure reflected in the window, and the gloomy mood in his heart was gradually wiped away, replaced by a sense of fulfillment and peace. Zhan Ruo's words rang in his ears again. For 200 years, you dared to kill people everywhere relying on the protection of your elder sister, but in the end you were unable to clean up the mess, causing your elder sister's early death. He was right. Back then, he was paranoid and crazy, and did many things that were willful, but in the end he was unable to clean up the mess. He thought that his death alone could save her kingdom, but he did not expect that she had already been deeply in love with him, and finally died early due to the pain. So in this life, he will not let the previous tragedy happen again, and will never repeat the mistakes of the previous life. Anyone who dares to destroy their relationship will die without a burial place. Rong Yu stared at the beautiful figure in front of the window that made him feel at ease. The coldness of his eyebrows and eyes faded, and the gentle color lingered in his eyes. He did not stay any longer and quickly walked into the hall. Author's words. I have read the comments of the babies. There are both praises and criticisms about the character of Zhan Ruo. Personally, I like him very much. Maybe my starting point is different from yours. He is a person who has clear likes and dislikes. His attitude towards Rong Yu is completely because of the things in his previous life. From his perspective, his attitude towards the culprit who caused the early death of the person he respected the most is normal. But there are reasons for not liking him, which is nothing. The main text of this book is actually coming to an end. The recent plot is indeed not as exciting as before, and it is a bit weak. I will try my best to give you a complete and perfect ending. There will be a side story. I am thinking about who to write about. You can leave a message. The weather has been cold these past 2 days, and the author has a severe cold and cough. After taking medicine today, I felt drowsy all day. I only wrote 2,000 words today, and I will make up for it later when I have time. Also, please be as gentle and tactful as possible when you comment, so that the author can be in a good mood when writing. Moi.